All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to use this kind of newfound conversions that we have for turning degrees into radians and radians into degrees, and we're just going to find we call them special angles, and basically these are just kind of like the benchmark angles. They're not really special; they're just ones that you'll see quite a bit. So you can see here we've got our zeros. You got all your big benchmarks, so your 90, your 180, your 270. We've got the 45s, so 135, 225, 315, and then you've got your 30, 60, 120, 150, 210, 240, so your increments of that, right? And those play pretty nicely with the radians as far as making fractions, right? So we start with knowing that 360 degrees is 2 pi radians, right? So that's how that happens. And then to go from there to 180, well, it's half of it, right? 180 is half of 360. Well, half of 2 pi, if you go 2 pi divided by 2, it's pi, right? And so that's this right here. And so then following that same logic, half of 180 is 90, right? So that would mean that you take pi, and if I divide pi by 2, I should get my equivalent measure there. Well, pi divided by 2 is just pi over 2, right? It doesn't really simplify. And so that's where this comes from, right? And the same thing with this one is I know that this is going to be the difference right here, right? You take 270, well, if this is 2 pi and pi, halfway between pi and 2 pi is going to be, 1.5 pi. And you write 1.5 pi as 3 pi over 2. Right? So that's where that comes from. And so now half of 90 degrees is 45, and that's where this pi over 4 comes from, because if you're finding half of pi over 2, that means you're like dividing it by 2, right? Well, that's the same thing as saying pi over 2 times 1/2, right? So you get pi over 4, and that's where that comes from. And so then you're going to have 3 pi over 4 here because it's, the same increment. So you just add pi over 4 this time. Well, that's how you get 3 pi over 4. And that's where these all come from. And this is how I remember these, right? I don't remember these by memorizing. I remember it by being able to figure it out. And now the pi over 3 and pi over 6, 2 pi over 3, 5 pi over 6 are a little trickier to remember. And the way I remember them, okay, is I start with my thirds. And I say, okay, if I take 180 degrees and I divide it by 3, I get 60 degrees. All right? So that would give me, 1/3 of 180, all right, is 60, right? And then 2/3 of 180 is 120. And then 3/3, which is a whole of 180, is 180, right? So that's how you kind of arrive and get to these numbers here. All right. So if that's the case, right, that means 60 degrees is going to be 1/3 of pi. Well, 1/3 of pi is pi over 3, right? 1/3 times pi is pi over 3. And 2/3 of pi is 2 pi over 3. And there's your 60 and your 120 that we talked about, right? So that's kind of where those come from. And then this pi over 6 is half of 60 degrees, right? So half of pi over 3 is like multiplying it by that, and that's where that comes from, right? And so all of these numbers, you can kind of derive them and get them by sort of doing some common sense converting with it, right? Again, same thing here. If you add 1/3 to pi, you get 4 pi over 3, doing your 60 degrees. Go another 60 degrees, right? You get your 5 pi over 3. And then this is your halfway mark between 5 pi over 3 and 6 pi over 3, right? So this would be 11 pi over 6, and then 7 pi over 6. So these make sense if you try to ration it out and figure it out, and I think you will really enjoy just knowing that it's not just completely arbitrary, right? So that's how we come together for those radian measures for these angles that we're going to use, these benchmark angles. So I hope this made a little bit of sense, me trying to show you like sort of how to find these on your own. Otherwise, obviously, you're just free to just reference this and just use it as needed, right? But it can be figured out, right? So yeah, so we're gonna go from here. We're gonna stop this video, and then the third video will be our homework help video.